I am honored to introduce this year's presenter of the Iwaasa Lecture on Urban Theology, Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne. The title of her lecture is Lessons from the Streets, the Liberative Wisdom of Brené Brown in Addressing Multiple Existential Threats. Welcome, Reverend Dr. Lansdowne.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good afternoon. I'm joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, the Squamish, Nikim, and Musqueam-speaking peoples of the Burrard Inlet in the lower mainland of what is now Greater Vancouver. And I'm thrilled to be joining you for this year's Iwaasa lecture in urban theology, even more so now that I've had a chance to hear Rachel speak about her father and his legacy. Shit disturber is an identification that is near and dear to my heart, and so many of the things that Reverend Iwaasa cared about are the things that I care about, and blessed to be here this morning, or this afternoon. So this morning, as I was editing my talk and rewatching Dr. Brené Brown's Netflix special, I had to laugh at myself because she talked about how her first TEDx Houston talk went viral when she had shed what she called her academic armor and made herself vulnerable to talk about vulnerability instead of the technical data that she studied around courage and vulnerability and shame. And she also talked about how the next day she had what she calls a huge vulnerability hangover. And I sort of laughed and cried at the same time. So after 5 years of working directly in leading frontline minimal barrier social service ministry and the social housing society that our church started in 1981, the academy is no longer where I'm really practiced at talking, but yesterday I gave a talk for the Department of Classics and Religions at the University of Calgary, and I think I must have psyched myself out because I went full on language of the academy, geeking out on like epistemology, theodicy, theology, teleology, probably some other big Greek fancy words. And I felt this like deep sense of shame after I finished. I don't often feel imposter syndrome, but now 6 years after finishing my PhD and not working full-time in the academy, I definitely felt out of place. Academic custom places a great importance on the dual tasks of research and teaching, and let me tell you, while I'm busy trying to breathe new life into a 136-year-old ministry that had been in decline for at least a decade, but is also so needed and so much a part of this neighborhood where I serve and this city more broadly, I don't do a lot of teaching or a lot of research these days. But I was vulnerable, and I decided to put myself out there and try to bring together some of the more high-level academic philosophies that I developed in my dissertation, in my doctoral studies, with the idea that from an Indigenous perspective, in a context in Canada of broken promises and broken systems, how we can consider what some philosophers call structural or administrative evil. And if God wants what's good for the world, then why do we still have political governance and corporate systems that still perpetuate deep injustice to society's most marginalized? Why does evil in that form exist in the world? So this morning, as I was finishing up today's talk, I could definitely relate to her concept of the vulnerability hangover. She also talks in one of her books or talks, probably many of her books and talks, about the Shame Gremlins. And the reason I think I had that feeling of imposter syndrome yesterday is I had these shame gremlins on my back before, during, and after the talk. And those shame gremlins kept saying to me, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes screaming at me, "You're not good enough. This talk isn't good enough." So now that I'm in a setting that's much more comfortable for me, I'm going to shake those shame gremlins off my back. One of the reasons I love Brené Brown is that for me, the concept of shame and how to deal with shame has been so foundational to me in my own life experience. And it was refreshing to hear this inspiring, charismatic, bright-eyed researcher talk about why it's important, and not just for each of us personally, but for society. I haven't read everything that she's written, but I've read and watched and listened to enough of her work. I thought it would be a good entry point for us to be in discussion about urban theology and just really how generally the world is messed up right now. And so just before we launch into the meat of my lecture, I also wanted to share one last reflection while I was finishing up this morning's preparations for our talk today. LinkedIn is actually my favorite form of social media. And I think it's because it's work-related, so generally people are slightly more civil to each other in this anonymous digital setting, which I really appreciate. Adam Grant is another thought leader, well known for his best-selling books, psychologist, in what I'm assuming is a plug for his newest book, which came out this year, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. He posted the following quote on LinkedIn. "It takes curiosity to learn, but it takes courage to unlearn. Learning requires the humility to admit what you don't know today. Unlearning requires the integrity to admit that you were wrong yesterday. Learning is how you evolve. Unlearning is how you keep up as the world evolves." I love that so much. So much of my personal journey, especially since my starting in my role as executive director at First United, has been about courage and curiosity. And I think that that's why Brené Brown's work is so appealing to me, because when you're courageous and curious, vulnerability becomes easier, and empathy becomes easier, and unlearning and learning becomes easier. All right, so what do I have to say about urban theology in a contemporary setting, and what is liberative about looking at all of that through the lens of Brené Brown's work? First, I'm going to take some time because I think it's important for you to understand the context in which I work and what I mean when I'm talking about urban theology. I'm really centering the experience of the very unique ministry and neighborhood that I serve. And then I want to talk about intersectionality. Intersectionality is it started as an academic concept. The name of the woman who coined it has escaped me right this moment, but it was an African-American scholar who talked about how we don't only see things from a racial perspective or a gendered perspective or a class perspective, that we bring all of those different pieces of who we are in the lenses that we approach the world through. And so it's become, especially within feminist and womanist and the scholarship of other women of color, a really important thing to name all of the intersections of the identities of who we bring ourselves to our work in as whole people. But I want to talk about intersectionality not from the perspective of me as a leader or a researcher or a practitioner, although that definitely comes into play in everything I do, but from the point of the intersection of all the systemic injustices that are causing the multiple existential threats that we face as humans. And that's what I loved about the fact that Reverend Iwaasa cared not just about poverty, not just about inclusion, not just about his experience of living in Canada, a very racist Canada, through the experience of the Second World War, but also residential schools and the environment, and that all of those things are connected to each other. And then lastly, I want to talk specifically about shame, vulnerability, courage, and empathy, all of those things that are explored much more in depth by Brené Brown as the focus of her work, and why I think tapping into her work of understanding ourselves and each other more deeply is critical for us in the work of seeking liberation together. In February 2017, I joined First United Church Community Ministry Society as their newest executive director. I figured out about 6 months into my role that I was also the executive director of First United Church Social Housing Society, which there's a management agreement between the two organizations, so I run both. Commonly known as First United, we are an inner city ministry of the United Church of Canada, committed at its heart to the struggle for social justice, offering programs of legal advocacy, housing, and healing in Vancouver's downtown east side, which has the misfortune of being Canada's poorest urban coastal code. There is here overwhelming homelessness and very high rates of mental illness and addiction, all of this exacerbated by deep poverty, the opioid crisis, the housing affordability crisis, and now COVID-19. In general, we serve adults with complex needs, and we strive to be a respectful resource to the downtown east side and those who are most in need of a welcoming place to be, to find support and to feel safe. We've been operating in the downtown east side for over 135 years, and we plan to keep our doors open to the neighborhood as a place to find sanctuary and connection. Our vision is a neighborhood where the worth of every person is celebrated and all people thrive. First United believes in the importance of being a presence of love and welcome in this place, and that's reflected in our programs that provide food, shelter, housing, activities, fun, and social connection as expressions of hospitality and grace. As a church, we recognize the need for nurturing and affirming the spirits of people in our community through sacred gatherings, memorials, and providing a place of sanctuary, care, and support. And our ministry with the neighborhood is also expressed in education and engagement on issues of social justice, advocating for social change, and giving voice to the challenges faced by many of our community members. We take an overarching approach to all our work that is supportive, empathetic, and trauma-informed and culturally appropriate. So First United has really found a balance between structure and place to just be. And we make every effort to meet people where they are. We try to know people by name, and we acknowledge their presence respectfully. We also use humor carefully, and it can be healthy and uplifting to laugh together in the presence of hardship. My mother said that the Creator gave us two forms of healing, laughter and tears. So one of my favorite community members often jokes with our staff at First United. Every time she sees Keely, our director of programs, she says, "You're my favorite staff infection." If you worked with people who are experiencing homelessness and mental illness and addiction and are living rough on the street, you'll know that staff infections are actually quite common. And so that's her little street humor pun. We serve at-risk populations, homeless, precariously housed, social housing residents, seniors, young adults ages 19 to 25, homeless shelter residents, sex workers, the LGBTQ2+ self-identified men and women in the community and gender non-binary, the working poor, Indigenous and other visible minorities, people experiencing mental illness, addictions, and co-occurring disorders. And we've determined that what works in our approach is three things: availability, so provision of service in the right place at the right time to meet the prevailing needs of this population; affordability, our housing, services, interventions, and programs are designed to be affordable to the people we serve. This is most often at no cost. We do charge for our housing. And acceptance, that there's really a fit between First United Church and the people that we serve. We are not the only social service agency or outreach ministry in the downtown east side. And we're really proud of the fact that many people come here because they choose to come here. And I also increasingly love to talk about our values because they're so important to us, affecting the type of change and impact that we strive for. So our core values are acceptance, discernment, empathy, accountability, and social justice. So acceptance is easy. We practice a presence of acceptance, caring for people no matter who they are, no matter where they are on life's journey, no matter their race, gender identity or expression, or who they love. We meet people where they are, and we offer help when asked. The second one, discernment, is a little bit odd, I think, for like a corporate value, but I love it. I think because it evokes like our spiritual tradition of discernment and prayer, but also the need for critical thinking. So we develop and grow our skill at using critical thinking and judgment in our interactions with the community we serve. We know that behavior is in itself communication, and sometimes rules can't be one size fits all, and that the world does need rules. And we use the same skills to plan how the organization should respond to the neighborhood we serve in prayerful discernment. Empathy. We practice empathy, truly seeing and hearing the experience of those around us. Empathy communicates to those we serve, you are not alone. And accountability. We show up and we go the extra mile. We deal with our own issues and we take ownership and responsibility for our work and its impact. And lastly, social justice. We aspire to a sustainable and equitable society. And why we do what we really do is really about the people that we serve. And I think it's important to talk for a few minutes about the context in which we live and work in this neighborhood. In British Columbia, the current income assistance level for individuals, still increased since COVID, is $935 a month and up to $1,358 per month for people living with disabilities. The shelter rate is $375 per month for an individual, but the average private single-room occupancy rental in the downtown east side was $517 a month in 2015. So estimates are that the average cost now exceeds $600 to $700 per month, leaving individuals with approximately $22 per day out of their income assistance on which to survive. With that $22 a day, they're supposed to cover access to a phone or technology, access to transit. Currently, a monthly one-zone transit pass for an adult in Vancouver is $100 as of this summer. There's also exactly one local market in the neighborhood where you can get a meal for less than $5. Never mind clothes, prescriptions, or the other necessities of life. The living wage calculator for Greater Vancouver estimates that in order to be able to meet the bare necessities of life in Vancouver, basic expenses are considered to be food, clothing, rental housing, childcare, transportation, and a small savings to cover illness and emergencies, is $19.50 per hour, or an annualized salary of $39,780 if you worked a 40-hour work week. People on basic income assistance in BC receive approximately $11,220 annually. Even if you look at CERB, the amount given to keep people from crashing into deep poverty was $500 a week or $26,000 a year, more than double what income assistance is in this province. And CERB was considered to be inadequate, but it was what the government could do politically in an expedient way at the start of the pandemic. If you aspire to more than a 10 by 10 foot room with no amenities and a single room occupancy in this neighborhood, the average rent for a one bedroom apartment is currently $2,150 per month in Vancouver. Granted, we don't work in the best neighborhood, but when I looked this morning, within a 6 block radius of the church, there were only 15 apartments available. The lowest rent was $1,095 and the highest was $8,000 per month for a one bedroom apartment. I could throw more statistics at you, but I think I've painted a bleak enough picture. The housing crisis across the city of Vancouver and the province and the country continues to worsen, despite the commitment of all levels of government to address housing affordability, and we've seen it as a major issue in this election. And I hope you all show up to vote for whoever you're going to vote for on Monday. New construction and attempts to address vacant homes and rent evictions can't keep up with growing demand, and rental vacancy rates are at record lows. They say that vacancy rates affect the average market rents, but we've seen that that isn't holding true in Vancouver. Before the pandemic, the average vacancy rate was just under 1%, and now the vacancy rate is just over 6%, but rents have gone up an average of $200 per month in the last 18 months. Market rents in Vancouver continue to be among the highest in Canada, while median income stagnates, barely exceeding the living wage rate. Some economists have rated Vancouver the most unaffordable city in the world, and this is in large part due to the low median income compared to the high cost of living. Gentrification is sometimes defined as the process of renovating and improving a neighborhood so that it conforms to middle class tastes. And with a massive investment in densification and redevelopment in the city of Vancouver through their social and urban planning, the potential impacts on the downtown east side are significant, despite zoning in parts of the community that prohibit strata development. In 2017, the then newly elected government created a Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions. Over the past 4 years, the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions has been building plans for increasing access to detox and treatment beds across the province, prescription opioid programs, and coordination of provincial responses to the fentanyl poisoning or overdose crisis, and access to safe drug supply. However, time has shown that there is significant infighting between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Mental Health and Addiction. So far, the total impact of the newly created ministry has been to create 83 jobs within the ministry itself, and it has not affected much, if any, improvement in the lives of those living with mental illness or addiction. Its number one goal in performance planning is to accelerate BC's response to the overdose crisis across a full continuum of substance use care that keeps people safe and improves the health and well-being of British Columbians. But between January and June of this year, we had already lost over 1,000 British Columbians to drug overdose by illicit drugs. And if the numbers continue to rise, by the end of this month, we will have surpassed 8,000 deaths in BC since our public health emergency of drug toxicity and overdose was declared in 2016. Between 2018 and 2020, fentanyl was present in 87% of illicit drug overdoses. If we keep up this pace, we are on track to see over 2,000 deaths in BC in 2021 from illicit drug overdose. Illicit drug overdose is now the leading cause of death for people in BC between the ages of 19 and 39. And those are just the deaths from overdose. British Columbia distributes between 4,000 and 5,000 naloxone or Narcan kits per month in this province. And that metric has been steady since March of 2017. The provincial rates of paramedic-attended overdose events has increased exponentially. In 2015, there were 8 events per 100,000 residents per month, just over 400 per month, or approximately 4,900 per year. By March of 2019, there were approximately 31 events per 100,000, so just over 1,570 overdoses attended by paramedics per month, or 18,864 per year. The numbers have increased since then, and not all overdoses are attended by paramedics. These metrics also include only the overdoses involving illicit drugs, not prescription drugs in British Columbia. I read somewhere once that there are an estimated 200,000 recorded opioid addicts in British Columbia, or approximately 4% of the population. The neighborhood where we work is often the poster child for the overdose crisis. And while we do have higher than average numbers of addicts per capita, our people are less likely to die from overdose. They're more likely to carry naloxone, they're more likely to know how to respond in an overdose, and they're less likely to use opioids alone. The overdose crisis is not an issue that only affects the poor and the homeless. It affects every neighborhood and many businesses and families. To put that public health emergency in context, COVID-19, which everyone is mobilizing every effort to combat and everyone is terrified of, since March 2020, there have been 177,000 cases, or almost 178,000 cases in BC, but only 1,888 confirmed deaths. This year, there will be twice as many deaths from illicit drug overdoses as the number of deaths from COVID. But we have yet to make really any headway in addressing the public health emergency of toxic drug deaths and accidental overdose in this province. Like many neighborhoods, the Downtown East Side also sees a very high racialization of poverty. While Indigenous people only make up 2 to 4% of the general population in BC, depending on the neighborhood, it's currently estimated that up to 40% of residents in this postal code identify as Indigenous, both status and non-status Indians, Métis, and Inuit. The intergenerational effects of the legacy of Indian residential schools, the gendered nature of the Indian Act in defining who is legally considered to be Indigenous in Canada, the 60s scoop, and the disproportionate and unconscionably high rates of Indigenous youth in the provincial foster care system in 2021 are palpable in this neighborhood. During the initial awareness of the missing Indigenous women and girls from the Downtown East Side, families often congregated at First United to catalyze support for an inquiry. We continue to sign on to calls for action on the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And we know and love the survivors of the serial murderer, Robert Pickton, but he hasn't been and won't be the only one. However, in practice, we ourselves have not always been a place of cultural or physical safety for Indigenous community members, and especially for women. The period of 2009 to 2012 was a particularly painful part of our history at First United, when, in an effort to become a no-barrier facility where there is no limits, no rules, a number of women and some men were victims of sexual assault in our building. Thankfully, the abuses were not by staff against the community, but our staff and leadership at the time failed to protect the people we serve, and this is a dark part of our history that we're still making a living amends for. And I assume in Calgary, where you got so much of the smoke from our forest fires this summer in BC, I don't need to revisit the climate emergency. With the entire town of Lytton wiped out in less than an hour due to a forest fire, the climate emergency is becoming more tangible and more urgent. In Kamloops, the country was horrified at the confirmation of 215 bodies in an unmarked grave at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, and that was in June or July. The number of bodies confirmed across the country in unmarked graves is now nearly 7,000, but we've just stopped talking about it. In some ways, it can feel like the end times are coming. I preached a sermon at a local congregation this summer where I was reminded of the first sentence of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. What a perfect way to sum up the last 18 months or so of our existence. And I'm reminded that Dickens wrote this, when there was great upheaval and still a lot of rampant disease and the growing poverty due to industrialization. But with this global pandemic, our true colors have been laid bare in some ways. And that pandemic has also been layered on top of other challenges that have also been at times states of emergency. It's been a doozy of an 18 months. A couple of years ago, I was at a We for She conference at the Convention Center in Vancouver with 1,300 other business and nonprofit leaders and high school students to talk about gender equity. I met a civil servant from the provincial government who'd come over from Victoria for the day. She asked me what I did, and I told her, and her reaction as she sucked in her breath was, "Ooh, the downtown east side, so hard. What's the answer?" As if there is one answer. I said, well, it's not sexy, but real poverty reduction could be a good start. Also, proper mental health and addiction supports that are integrated with the medical system. Despite every newspaper hawking images of street homeless with a needle stuck in their arm every time there's an article about the overdose crisis, 90% of the deaths in this province were outside of this neighborhood. They were lawyers and dentists and housewives and corporate directors and servers and construction workers. They were everyday, regular, normal people. The truth is, addiction and mental illness are generally the result of intergenerational, chronic, or acute trauma. Poverty may not be the thing that always causes somebody to end up in the downtown east side, but if you have addiction and or mental illness and you end up poor, you don't really stand a chance at recovery. Or you can recover, but sort of against all odds. And I've often described the downtown east side as sort of a microcosm of Canadian society. It's the end result of all of the failed systems in our country. The truth is, if love was enough, the downtown east side wouldn't exist. The truth is, when I look at these streets crowded with people, I see the survivors of residential schools, the ones who didn't end up in graves. I see rape victims. I see queer children disowned by their parents because of their sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. I see people who were in car accidents and never recovered. I see people traumatized by divorce, loss, and bankruptcy. I see undocumented workers and immigrants and refugees, largely people of color, whose dream of a better life in Canada was shattered by overt racism and discrimination. I see my cousins. I see my dead older brother. I see your former staff and employees. I see your sons and daughters. I see you. All of these things, together with COVID-19, have certainly made for a really challenging time. It's no wonder we spent most of last winter languishing, as the New York Times so aptly put it. But the end result is that we can often end up more divided. There's a really challenging dynamic when the stigma of that end result of all of those failed systems and those intersections of injustice cause people to think that a brown-bodied woman, especially if she's queer, who has a mental illness and an addiction, and who's experiencing homelessness, and maybe is a subsistence street worker, sex worker on the streets of the downtown east side, is there somehow due to some kind of moral personal failing. And the stigma associated with that is just a complete lack of ability to see the humanness in the other. And that's why our vision is a neighborhood where the worth of every person is celebrated and all people thrive. I think my favorite Brené Brown quote is, "Everyone has a story that will break your heart." And if you really listen, everyone has a story that will bring you to your knees. And that's why I think talking about shame and courage and empathy and the difference between empathy and sympathy and the idea of rumbling in the arena is so attractive to me. Part of my story, like Brené Brown's, is that 20 years ago, I made a decision to abstain from drugs and alcohol. And, I really had to rumble with my own sense of shame, the difference between shame and guilt, the difference between shame that is the result of, my own adult actions and shame that I carried from my childhood. And for me, one of the things I learned early in my recovery is that there's a difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is the sense of I did something wrong, I did something against my value system, and the gift that I get from that is an awareness of how I want to be in the world and the opportunity to not do that thing again. But shame is the message that I am wrong. Not that I did something wrong, but that I am wrong, that I'm not enough, that I am not worthy of love and acceptance and inclusion. And whether it's a message that we carry from our childhoods or whether it's the result of struggling through all of these different things that make it harder and harder to be in the world, shame is the thing that holds us down and sucks the life out of us. And it's such an important thing for us to be able to have not a sense of sympathy, which is like, oh, I feel so sorry for you. Like, even if I don't see your context as personal moral failing, that I still feel sorry for you because of all these systems that have created your context. Whereas empathy is this really, truly this idea that you are not alone. I don't have to fix you. I don't have to do anything for you necessarily, except for to say, I see you. I see your brokenness. I see your hurt. I don't know how to fix it either, but I'm going to be here with you. And then courage. I really love her. Relying on the quote from Teddy Roosevelt on the man in the arena, and I'm going to share it with you in case you haven't heard it. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who knows at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. And I really like that idea that she talks about like rumbling with all of the messiness of trying to untangle this mess up human existence that we've created. And so I want to have time for us to have some discussion, but I also wanted to share with you a couple of things, probably some more Brené Brown quotes, but also the best book that I think I can think of that I've read in a long time by Mariana Mazzucato, who's an Italian economist teaching in London, who wrote a book called Mission Economy. I can't remember the subtitle. It has something to do with moonshot something or other. But it's the first book that's really given me hope for the future in a long, long time. It's described by Nature magazine as a timely and optimistic vision, rethinking the role of government nationally and in the international economy to put public purpose first and solve the problems that matter to people, and that these are now the central questions for humanity. And so why I love that is I had the experience while I was doing my PhD in California of, I'm trying to figure out how to do the Coles Notes version of this. I got pregnant and married while I was living in California, and then decided, I also married an undocumented worker. And so if you can imagine, I was a doctoral student living in one of the most expensive cities in the US, and my husband's undocumented worker with very low earning capacity. And so I decided that it would be really irresponsible for us to live in a lot of poverty now that we had brought this other human into the world. And so I decided, I made the difficult decision to work full-time while I was finishing my PhD. And I first worked for an organization called Alliance for Climate Education that was really, their mission was to catalyze a generation of future voters who would care about and understand the climate emergency, that they would understand the science behind the climate emergency, but become motivated voters to help to shape public policy and the political engagement required to confront the climate emergency. And then I left there and I became part of the HR management team at an innovation summer camp company that provided summer camps for elementary school age children to teach them the skills they needed for innovation. And my thinking was, wow, if these kids that we're teaching about climate change had the innovation skills they needed to overcome some of these challenges, then the world would be in an even better place. And our mission at Galileo was to develop innovators who envision and create a better world. And I learned a lot about the design process there, like coming out of the Stanford B-School situation, and about human-centered design and creating empathy as the ground, or like the ground layer or the first step in solving any problem. That we cannot actually look at a problem and jump straight to a solution, that we really have to understand all aspects of the problem, all the people affected by the problem, what their needs are, and then have a certain set of skills and knowledge that allows us to try rapidly and to try and fail in order to get to a process where innovation results in an adequate solution that meets the needs of the people who are suffering this problem. And so what I love about Matsukato's work is that I feel like if you took Brené Brown and Mariana Mazzucato and put them in the room, they could probably solve like 90% of the world's problems, because Brené Brown deals with the messiness of our human relationships and the way that we have to deal with our own shame and courage and vulnerability. And then Mariana Mazzucato has taken this idea of like empathy-based, like common good. We can't focus on like, which KPIs or metrics the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is using to like measure, or what algorithms they're using to predict the Fraser sockeye run, that we have to say, we have to protect our oceans. Like, we're running out of time. And so how are we going to do that? And she uses the Apollo mission as an indicator of how President Kennedy had set this bold vision, like we have to have a man on the moon within a decade. And we're going to spend way more money than we're comfortable spending to do that. But we are going to catalyze the world. We're going to catalyze America to put a man on the moon, and our national security and the future of this country depends on it. And there's this infamous story about somebody working for NASA as a janitor, and when somebody asked him what he did, he's like, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. And we don't think about things together in that way. Like, everybody has their own things that they're trying to do. Oftentimes they seem like they're not that effective, and it can be really dispiriting to think like it's never enough. And I think this idea of getting in the arena together and getting messy together, and doing the work together of confronting all of these systems of injustice is really, really important if we want to survive and thrive as humans. And so there's this Brené Brown quote that says, "I want to be in the arena. I want to be brave with my life. And when we make the choice to dare greatly, we sign up to get our asses kicked. We can choose courage or we can choose comfort, but we can't have both, not at the same time." And then she says, "You either walk inside your story and you own it, or you stand outside your story and you hustle for your worthiness." And I really want to be the type of person who's standing inside my story and owning it. And I don't have the answers, but I do think that a better world is possible, and that we have the joint care and compassion to come together and to solve the world's biggest problems. We just need the space and time and work to do that, because we'll get into the questions in a second, but I can see one question saying, "Can you describe the theological vision that informs your life and work?" And to Rachel's point about asking her dad how he could continue to serve a church that had participated in the residential school process, that was a question that got asked of me yesterday, like in a very polite and much more eloquent way. It's like, how can you still be like Native and Christian given this history? And I think that what I learned in my very first theology class in grad school with the late Sally McFig is that theology matters. Like what we think and believe and say about who we think God is in the world matters. And I do believe that the Creator wants life for us and life in abundance. That's a very traditional value of Indigenous cultures pre-contact, is that the world is a place of abundance, and that we only need to take what we need because we have this belief that there will always be enough. I think this idea of enough as opposed to progress, or like who is our economic growth serving, all of these things like that, and capitalism is really broken. And I think that Matsukato has a really great vision for not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. She's not saying that capitalism is inherently evil, but that our current expression of capitalism needs some serious redirection. And those are the kinds of conversations that I'm interested in having. So I'm going to wrap it up there because I'm talking at you for a little bit, and I'm interested to hear from our moderators some of your questions and to riff a little bit more extemporaneously on what I think about the world.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Lansdowne. I'm just going to clap for everybody who we can hear. That was wonderful. We've got a number of questions already in the chat, which I'll read out. I know you've answered one or two already. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a filler of some of the things that you raised. I looked up, the intersectionality quote that you mentioned, who was the scholar's name, is Crenshaw. Williams Crenshaw. So I looked that up for you.
Thank you.
And then the, which is very interesting subtitle, you were talking about Mariana Mazzucato's Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, which sounds like a wonderful book that you've just been alluding to. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go read the questions out for you and invite any other members of the audience to please type into the chat questions you have. And these were coming in as you were speaking. So, and I have to say, I was thinking of many of these too. And I'm sure many of our audience was that the challenges you face are immense. It must be emotionally draining at times. How do you maintain your spiritual strength to carry on?
That's a really good question. I like to joke, it's not a secret because it's in the acknowledgements of my dissertation, but my husband is a lapsed Catholic, and he used to like to joke with me when we were dating about how priests and theologians were useless sons of bitches. And which I'm glad my grandmother is no longer with us, because she would be appalled that I shared that with you publicly. And, you know, for a while, you know, especially after we started our family and, you know, we have 2 kids that are under 12, a lot of our weekends were out hiking in nature and doing the things that my husband found spiritually gratifying. And, you know, I was in this world of like deep theological thought and engagement all the time. And I was serving on the board of the World Council of Churches at the time. And so the end result of that, I think, you know, and I still, I kind of dip my toes in the pool of going to the local United Church close to my house, because we actually don't have Sunday worship at First United anymore. We haven't for over a decade. And, you know, because I'm well known in United Church circles, I walked in the door and I was like, oh, Carmen moved to our neighborhood and she's going to come to this church. And then I saw a member of the congregation who was picking up her grandchildren from my children's school, and I was picking up my children. And, you know, I'd just been busy, and I was single parenting for the first 2 months after I moved back from Canada, because my husband was still living in the US, having just become an American, and then we had to go through the immigration process for him to move to Canada. And she sort of did that like really shitty thing that happens in church. Well, we haven't seen you often at church. I was like, well, you know, I go to church at least 5 days a week. But I've really found since I don't know what it was, like, I feel like with, you know, before the pandemic, church was like, Sunday worship was always there, or like the possibility of like gathering with people for a meditation group, or, you know, Bible study, or whatever, that was always there. And I knew it was there. And then the inability to gather in person just somehow tweaked in me, like, oh, I miss church. I miss worship. And I've been kind of coasting on this decade or more of busyness within ecclesial structures and like thinking theologically, but I actually miss that spiritual practice. And so I've started going back to Sunday worship. I forgave the lady that pointed out that I wasn't there often, got over myself, and I practice yoga, or I have at times had a very consistent yoga practice. I've restarted a yoga practice, and I'm working with my physician on like more mindfulness and learning just like, I've learned how to recognize when I feel my heart rate rise due to stress, and to just, the mantra I have for myself is like, there's no tiger at my door. Oh, that's interesting. My body is feeling stressed. That's not good for my body. So I'm just going to stop and take some breaths. There's no tiger at my door. Another great one I have from my boss at Galileo is, don't panic, just fix it. So when, you know, there's always unexpected happening here.
I'm sorry, Carmen, I just missed the last one. What was the one that you got from your boss? Yeah. Don't
panic, just fix it. And that has been essential here in like keeping my stress levels low, because in this community, like nothing surprises me anymore about the kinds of adventures people find themselves in, or the kinds of trauma that my staff are experiencing, both vicariously and directly. Listening to music. I now do a monthly, like 1 day offsite by myself. So there's a great, you know, we're 90 minutes from Whistler, and Whistler is considered part of our local health region. And so even, except for like the most lockdown moments over the last year, I've been able to go up to Whistler, and there's this great place with these outdoor, like, I don't know, like hot springs and saunas and steam baths. And they have this cycle of like hot, cold, relax. And it's silent. You're not, once you walk out of the change room, you're not allowed to talk. And so I spend the day once a month, like doing something that actually is like physically detoxing my body and but also reading and thinking and writing and not needing to engage with like all of the busyness that comes with the administration of, you know, these two important societies. So.
I think it's an important point to remind people that they do need to take time for themselves, simple but true, to find these moments of quiet and calm. Mm-hmm. Now, here's for something a little bit different. You were talking about shame and guilt. And so one of the audience members says, how has Christianity dealt with the concept of shame?
Not in very healthy ways, I would say, most generally. Because I think, you know, like there's Rita Nakashima Bracken, Rebecca and Parker wrote this really great book called Proverbs of Ashes, and talking about the ways in which actually we have, what Christianity has like perpetuated deep shame, especially in the abuse of women, and the gaslighting that the church does around gendered violence. And I would say that's also true with racial violence and the, you know, the ways that the church has either directly participated in cultural genocide, like in residential schools, or turned a blind eye to other really horrific evils, like, you know, I think 90% of Canadians were Christian during the Second World War period, where we turned a boat of Jewish refugees from the Holocaust away and said one Jew is too many in this country. I think the church is actually a source of deep shame for many, many people. And there are huge communities of people who have been deeply, deeply hurt and abused, traumatized by the church and by Christianity. And I don't think that we've actually done a good job at really acknowledging that and learning what it means to make a living amends, right? Like, I had the experience of going to the General Council of the United Church in 2006, and at the time we were talking about the 30th anniversary of the 1986 apology of the United Church to Indigenous peoples. And that was just like, that was not the residential school apology that came later in 1998, but it was like, just for like, whoa, we were like, you know, participating in these systems of white supremacy and colonization. And we told you that your way of being in the world was wrong. And for that, we're sorry. And the Indigenous churches never actually formally accepted that apology. We've said like, okay, that's a good start. Now let's see how you change before we talk about whether or not we accept that apology. And that change has been really, really slow. And because I was there sort of in an ex officio role as the representative to the World Council of Churches, I wasn't a voting commissioner, I wasn't a small table group. I just sort of walked around and listened to the conversations people were having. And I also have like the blessing and the curse of passing for white. And like, unless people know me, they don't necessarily know that I'm Indigenous. And I heard like the most horrible racist things coming out of people's mouths. And, or I heard people saying like, why are you still talking about this? This is stupid. Like, how was your summer vacation? Like, I'm not going to talk about that. And so, you know, at the very best we can say like, this was wrong, but we haven't done the individual and corporate work of actually addressing our own corporate shame as bodies of faith for the ways in which the church has not lived into this vision of like God wanting us to be in right relationship with God and with all of created order. And then the worst is like the theological like justification for like perpetuating shame and using those atonement theologies to be like, oh, that's just your cross to carry, or things like that. And I don't think that that's consistent with what God wants for us. And so I think we do it really poorly. And I think it's a place for us to, I mean, I think this is where if you kind of like engage with Brené Brown's work in your local community of faith, and you think about like, well, what does empathy mean? And what does it mean to really understand the experience of the other and not to have to try to fix it, but just to really understand it. If you pair that with like Adam Grant's idea of unlearning and having the courage to unlearn and to say what I knew yesterday was wrong, but I'm going to get curious and I'm going to watch the world evolve around me and I'm going to come on board, I think that we have the possibility to sort of unpack all of that. But church often can be a place that's not really safe.
Just wanted to interject a question of my own that arises from your discussion about capitalism as well. And I'm wondering if that sometimes might be more of a struggle to break through and discuss how things, how issues and problems such as homelessness, as you were talking about, the cost of just trying to scrape by the rents, the cost of living, etc. And at the core of that, I guess one could argue is the capitalist drive of increasing one's wealth and property cost, etc. Is that sometimes more difficult to address when you're talking to people than issues maybe that might be embedded within the church itself, such as these examples of shame that you were talking about, but trying to get people to look at capitalism from a different perspective than they now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's because like with the increasing disparities between wealth and poverty, it becomes like a really defensive thing for the people who are surviving, however tenuously, or thriving in the current manifestation of capitalism, the way we practice it, becomes defensive. Like, well, I agree it's broken, but don't really ask me to do anything that's going to actually result in a loss for me, right? And I think that the neoliberal form of economics perpetuated by like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and to a lesser extent Brian Mulroney in Canada in the early 80s, and this idea that trickle-down economics was going to work and that public investment in government structures was bad, has had really profound and lasting impacts on what people think is possible. I think actually, if you've read the book, The Marrow of Thieves, which is sort of a dystopian novel about like the crashing of society as we know it in North America, and how one of the biggest social impacts was that the dominant society lost the ability to dream, but Indigenous people kept the ability to dream, and so they reinstituted the residential school system with the purpose of harvesting the marrow from Indigenous people, because that's where our dreams lived, and resulting in like an actual genocide. And I won't give any more away about the novel, but I think that one of the things that happened in that, in the rise of baby boomers and buying into this idea that like if you work hard and you like participate in the rat race and you don't worry about like the ethical implications of your investments and you build your own net worth, that the work would be, that you're going to achieve the American dream, the Canadian dream. And the really, really significant disinvestments in our public infrastructure, we're only just seeing the worst impacts of those now. But I think the worst thing that it did is it robbed us of our sense of the common good. It robbed us of our sense of obligation to each other. It robbed us of a sense of like the way that the market is not perfect. And so there need to be some things that correct the market, and like maybe the wealthiest need to pay more in order to allow that all of creation, and all humans can live in abundance. And we just this is why yesterday in my talk with the department at the university, I shared this story of this part of our potlatch system in the Central Coast in Kwakwaka'wakw culture around the Hamatsa dance, which is a cannibal dance, where the person becomes overwhelmed with this greed, sense of greed and like isolation or individualism that sets them so far apart from their values and their community that they would go so far as to eat human flesh. And I think that in some ways, over the last 30, 40 years, we have been overcome by, in Indigenous cultures further east, there's the idea of the Wendigos. But for us, it would be the Hamatsas, or in my culture, in Heiltsuk culture, would be the Tanis. And this drive to consume that is really, really unhealthy. And I don't think that we have also, there's less people involved in volunteerism, there's less people giving to charity, there's less people engaged in community groups, like service groups, and there are less places, we sort of have this like social media activism where like, this is my position, I'm going to put it on social media, without thinking about, one, the climate impacts of all of the data storage, but two, not thinking about the fact that there's algorithms that like sort of, predictive algorithms that direct who we interact with as part of that. But we're not having like nuanced conversations. So there's I can't say his name because sometimes I'm not really good at pronouncing South Asian names, but the title of the book is Winners Take All. And he talks about the way that like thought leadership, and there's like these soundbite things, which he would probably put Brené Brown in that camp. But I like her because she's still an active academic, and I know there's like really deep research behind what she puts out into the public world. But this idea of thought leadership has replaced public discourse, and that we actually can't solve the challenging problems of this world with thought leadership. We need deep public discourse. We need to make time to sit down with each other in circle. And I think that's a gift that, the methods of like talking circles in Indigenous culture, and like sitting and being with each other and really like coming to consensus about things.
Could I interject here? Because that ties in.
That's like a big riff, but
it ties in with another question. But before I ask that, I've been asked if you could repeat the title of the book. Was it The Marrow Thieves?
Yeah, The Marrow Thieves. The
Marrow Thieves, right. Yeah. And do you remember who the author was?
It's Sherry Dimaline, so Dimaline. It's a young adult. It's kind of like in the whole thing of like the Divergent series or Hunger Games. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
The question that was you were heading towards, I think, is when you were talking about Brown and about getting messy, right? Mm-hmm. And so the question is, what are the biggest barriers to getting messy together? How do you initiate this, or how do you? Or what are the barriers, right?
Sorry, I tried to post the other book, the Winners Take All book, to everybody, but I just sent it to a few of you. Time. So in that Netflix special, she thanks the audience for coming and said, time is the one like non-renewable resource that is like so precious. And I think that comes back to this idea of mindfulness as a spiritual practice, is we have to choose to make time, right? Like so much of, in getting back to that first question about how do I feed my spirit and how do I practice self-care given all of these things, is, I don't do it perfectly. And like, this has been a terrible example of a week because I was on vacation for all of August. And then this month I have, like, aside from my day job, 2 board meetings for the 2 organizations that I run, 11 hours of board meetings for the Vancouver Foundation, an in-person 3-day meeting for Sandy Saulteaux Centre, plus committee meetings, plus like starting to do student interviews for the Indigenous Candidacy Board, plus I have 2 book chapters due. And in hindsight, I'm like, I didn't really plan my vacation all that well, because it would have been better for me to take a month off in July and then like be present at work in August and not be burning the candle at both ends for the last 2 weeks to try and make it through this month. But, you know, when I do try to be really mindful about how I spend my time. So I'm less and less likely to, you know, sit and binge watch Netflix. You know, I've started to like for a while after I finished my PhD, I was like, oh my God, I never want to look at another book ever again. But now I'm reading on average about like a book a week, because I make time to read. I have, you know, like screens off at 9. When I'm in my practice of mindfulness, screens off at 9, and then I read till I'm tired. I'm generally in bed by 10:30. I get a good night's sleep. I try to make time in my calendar to do things that bring me joy. So I love to go to movies. I have another colleague in the United Church here who's a huge movie buff, and he's my gay boyfriend, and that's what we do together for social time, is we go to movies together. I try to intentionally choose things that bring me joy. And that means also being mindful in how I'm present to my kids. And so like recently I've caught, especially the last couple of weeks, I've caught myself like, my kids are talking about it, put down my phone. Like I'm not being present to what they're, you know, they're in their first couple of weeks of school and they're excited and, you know, back with their friends. And I'm missing it because I'm on my phone. And I've also done things like I created a book club with another housing CEO. And we sort of were like, we noticed on LinkedIn that we were reading a lot of the same books. And then we were like, well, we should start a book club. And so I was like, okay, well, if you could pick anybody in Vancouver to be in this book club with you, who would you pick? He said, okay, well, who would you pick? And then we asked all those people and they all said yes. So, I mean, we've got like really amazing leaders within the nonprofit sector, within civil servants, with politicians that all said yes. And our book club is called Books That Matter, and they're all social justice focused, and we alternate like fiction and nonfiction. And we meet for an hour once a month. No judgment if you didn't get the book finished or you didn't read it at all. And we're creating this like really intense time to talk about the things that we care about. And I started it right before the pandemic, and so unfortunately, the pandemic hampered this initiative. But I had a former ED for another organization in the downtown east side who was doing some contract work for me in communications, and she said that one of the reasons why she said yes to coming to do some work for First United was because she wanted to work with me. Because she's like, I saw you, and I was like, that is a high capacity woman, and I need more high capacity women in my life. And I was like, I know some really great high capacity women, and so I started the High Capacity Women's Club, and we go out for dinner like once a month. Except that we haven't gone out for dinner except for the first time because then the pandemic happened. But, you know, we just went out for dinner, and it was sort of like Dutch treat, and we just talked about the things that we cared about. And, you know, I've started showing up for politicians' debates and just like really, really being thoughtful and curating my time about like, how do I continue to be engaged in the world in a way that creates joy, but it also is in service of the types of change I want to see in the world.
Thank you so much for that. There's an interesting question here, because you talked about, you said you had imposter syndrome by giving a talk, which you shouldn't have, because it was an excellent talk that you gave yesterday at the University of Calgary in the Department of Classics and Religion. So moving into the academic world, you were talking about going back into that. And there's a question here that asks you, how was your experience moving from the academic environment when you first finished your PhD to profound reality change, you know, when you got into ministry? I mean, how was that adjustment moving from a more theoretical, academic, atmosphere to one that was more practical, or maybe, as we would say, messy.
Yeah. I think in some ways it was really natural for me. My parents have always supported First United. They were married at First United. My mom being Heiltsuk and my dad was a commercial fisherman, and it was just sort of like the downtown east side was their hood, and it was very much more like a working class neighborhood. And there were some hobo alcoholics that were like on the corner, but it was nothing like the sort of deep poverty and addiction and mental illness and like people on the streets that you see today. But it has always, for like at least since the First World War, been the neighborhood of the most marginalized in Vancouver. And the way that my mother raised me was to say, unless we are doing theology and ministry with integrity that serves the people of the downtown east side, we're not doing it with integrity anywhere else. Like, sort of that biblical, like what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, right? And so she was, I mentioned this yesterday in the talk, Johann Metz in The Passion for God talks about, oh no, this wasn't in the Calvary talk, it was in the Christ seminar, talks about how as Christians we fail the test of Auschwitz, right? Like, or his contemporary Moltmann would say that anytime we allow injustice to happen, we're re-crucifying Jesus, right? And so I was raised with this very like liberationist political bent to my my academic life, and I think that I saw doing doctoral work in theology as more a way to explain the world that I saw, rather than wanting to and to translate like these cultural differences of being Indigenous in Canada, and wanting to be able to like think deeply and convince people about why social justice mattered, and I also see the limits of, like, I think that most of our universities in North America are failing, and the things that made North American universities so strong in terms of this dual part of like research and teaching has been sort of like eroded by the professionalization of like the administration of the university, and the fact that the financialization of universities and the unaffordability of universities, and now like faculties can't afford to have tenure track faculty at the levels that they used to, and the ratios that they used to. And so so many of my contemporaries that were graduating around the same time as me couldn't get jobs teaching theology or biblical studies. I think the Association for Theological Schools says there's something like an average of 500 applicants for every tenure track, 500 qualified applicants with a completed PhD applying for every tenure track job in North America. And I kind of saw the writing on the wall, and it was like, I've taken on this massive student loan to do my PhD in Berkeley. I have a young family, and I can't afford to like have this side hustle of like pulling together, what do they call it? Contingent work as an adjunct person, like getting paid $3,000 per course, right? And so it was really natural for me to sort of give up this idea of teaching in a theological educational context, and to move into sort of like this practical theology. And I still, it keeps me really busy, but I still try and keep one foot in the academy, because that is one of the things that brings me joy. And to go back to a further point, but I've also, I started my career in KPMG, and then have worked in like nonprofit leadership, like outside of the church. And so I was able to bring sort of my executive leadership skills and my administrative skills and my governance skills into this leadership role, but very deeply theologically grounded in our faith tradition, in a way that I think makes it less challenging than it might be for somebody else.
Well, thank you for that. We're almost out of time, but I think everything that you have been addressing and speaking about, really, if anybody wants to ask what is urban theology, I think they need to look at you and what you're doing. I think you embody that. So thank you so much for making that manifest. It's been a wonderful afternoon. And so I thank you, the university thanks you, Calgary thanks you, the public library, and the audience for sharing your time and wisdom with us.